Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue with part 3 of chapter 3 from the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. This chapter yet again having to do with close encounters of the third kind. In other words, with actual creatures, extraterrestrials, aliens, grays, and so on. Excellent examples that the author has portrayed here within the chapter. I've noticed some of the ones that I've mentioned in the past in some of my videos and some new ones too, some new ideas. So definitely looking forward to seeing what's listed here. Plus, this will wrap up the actual chapter itself. And then the next chapter, we'll be talking about close encounters of the fourth kind, which is, of course, one of the most scariest ones yet. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's do part 3 here. I'd love to hear what your own thoughts and comments are as well. And then I'll give my own once this particular reading is finished. So in this part, this segment, it's called an alien projection. So here's what it says. Encounters with apparent alien entities are strange enough, but the following case has an additional aspect that is yet more bizarre, but which might shed light on the origin of such creatures. This encounter happened in Argentina on the night of June 13th, 1968 at about 12:50 a.m. The witnesses were Senor Pedro Pretzel, the 39-year-old proprietor of the Motel La Cuesta near the small town of Villa Carlos Paz, which lies about 500 miles to the west of Buenos Aires in the province of Cordoba, and his 19-year-old daughter, Maria Eladia. On the night in question, Senor Pretzel was walking home when he spotted a strange object about 55 yards beyond the motel, apparently resting on the highway that ran past the building. The object had two very intense red lights, which were projecting their beams at the motel. Although at first he thought it might have been a car, Pretzel realized that no car has taillights that can project laser-like beams. Almost immediately, the object vanished, and Pretzel hurried into the motel. Entering the kitchen, he found his daughter lying unconscious on the floor, apparently having fainted. He managed to revive her and asked her what happened. Maria Eladia replied that after a few minutes before she had said goodnight to her fiancé, she had seen some guests to the door and then returned to the kitchen. But at that moment, she saw that the lobby was filled with light, which was impossible since she had just switched all the lights off. So she returned to the lobby to investigate and was confronted by a 6-foot-tall man dressed in a single-piece suit that seemed to be made out of blue scales. The man had fair hair and was holding a gyrating blue sphere in the palm of his raised left hand. On the fourth finger of his right hand, he wore a very large ring, which he moved up and down in front of her. Maria's initial terror was rapidly replaced by uncontrollable lethargy, which increased as she was flooded with light emanating from the man's hands and feet. It seemed that Maria's fear had been inappropriate, although understandable, since the man exuded goodness and kindness and smiled at her throughout the encounter. She also had the feeling that he was attempting to communicate with her. Although his lips did not move, she could hear a faint voice that she compared to Chinese. Maria was held like this for some moments, and then the man walked slowly and precisely to the side door, which was open, and when he walked through it, the door closed behind him. As soon as the man had departed, Maria fainted. Pretzel reported the incident to the local police. For some days afterward, Maria became prone to weeping fits and was very nervous. It seems possible that the man Maria Eladia encountered was not really there at all. He might well have been a projection, a moving hologram beamed into the house by the object that her father had seen outside. If this is the case, perhaps other UFOs and non-human entities are of a similar nature, projected into our reality from an unknown source. This idea will be considered in more detail later on in the book. Next segment is called a cerebral mystery. Alleged alien beings who contact humans are fond of uttering outlandish prophecies which rarely come true. One case from the 1970s, which is as comical as it is bizarre, occurred in Palos Verdes, Southern California. Two men in their late 20s were driving home from their friend's house one night when they encountered two strange objects on the highway. As the car approached, its headlights illuminated the objects, which appeared to be human brains the size of basketballs. Stunned, the two friends slowed down and spent a few moments observing the brains through the car windows before maneuvering around them and then continuing on their journey. The driver took his friend home and then drove to his own house. In total, the journey should have taken about 10 minutes, but the driver discovered that it had actually taken 2.5 hours. He was at a total loss to explain this missing time. This case was investigated by Ann Druffel, who gave the driver the pseudonym John Hodges. During regressive hypnosis, he recalled being taken into a room after he had taken his friend home, where he encountered one of those brains. The brain spoke to him telepathically, with a voice that seemed to come from within him. Also in the room were a number of tall, gray-skinned humanoids, apparently crewmen. They had web features as if their natural habitat was aquatic. Hodges was shown a series of three-dimensional holographic images of nuclear explosions. The brain then proceeded to lecture him on humanity's misuses of nuclear power, a favorite subject with aliens. It was during one of the hypnosis sessions that Hodges realized that the gray creatures were actually in control, and the brains were biomechanical translation devices. During the encounter, a tiny translator cell was inserted in Hodges' brain, through which the aliens would be able to communicate with him. He was then returned to his car. In the years following his encounter, John Hodges received numerous messages from the aliens through his translator cell, largely prophetic in nature and totally inaccurate. The messages told of a war that would begin in the Middle East and then spread through Europe between 1982 and 1984, and in which nuclear weapons would be used. After that war ended, there would be a single world government, and the aliens themselves would land en masse in 1987. While conceding that such stories as this sound like errant nonsense, British researcher Ginny Randalls comments on the apparent absurdity of many other close encounters and wonders if there might be a common source for them. They involve ghost-like beings, weird monsters, spirit entities, and a veritable menagerie of aliens from all over the universe. Yet all of them share an underlying theme and many inconsistent internal characteristics. Could these experiences stem from a source that is somewhat closer to home, namely ourselves? This is an idea that we shall return to later. Next segment is called The Ghost That Wore a Spacesuit. Another baffling and shocking case occurred on Cyprus in September 1968. At 3 a.m., a British Army NCO stationed at Dakalia Barracks was alerted to a possible intruder by his dog. The Turkish wolfhound, a formidable beast, rose to its feet and began to growl. Its fur was standing on end. Clearly, it was perceiving a potential threat nearby. The soldier's first thought was of an imminent terrorist attack on the barracks. He moved silently to the door, intending to gauge the situation before deciding on a response. As he did so, the wolfhound scurried under the bed and began to whimper in terror, a most unusual act for such a fierce animal. At this point, the soldier heard a high-pitched humming sound that gradually grew in intensity. Totally at a loss to explain either the strange sound or the stranger behavior of his dog, the soldier decided to risk going out to the landing to see what was happening. It was an act he doubtless wishes he had never even contemplated. He opened that door and tentatively stopped on the landing. A few feet away, a flight of wooden steps led down to the ground level. When he looked down the steps, the soldier saw something he would never forget, no matter how desperately he tried. Floating up towards him was a being, or rather the head and shoulders of a being. As he watched in horror, the humanoid thing continued to approach. All that was visible was its upper portion. It was dressed in a light blue suit with a collarless neck. Its face, glowing bright orange, was inclined forward slightly and had a strange, scowling expression. Its eyes were very large, round and unblinking beneath a shock of red hair. As it proceeded up the stairs towards the landing and the now petrified soldier, it looked around, swiveling its head a full 180 degrees. By now, the soldier had seen more than enough. In panic, he raced back to the safety of his room, slammed the door, and then sat on the edge of his bed, trembling in abject terror. The strange whining noise outside continued to rise in intensity, eventually reaching a nerve-shattering crescendo. It was now accompanied by a sliding sound, as if this being were moving towards the door. The soldier grabbed an underwater spear gun, loaded it, aimed at the door, and fired. Whether because of this or for some other unknown reason, the sliding sound and the machine-like humming gradually faded away, and the soldier was left alone with his cowering wolfhound. There he stayed until he was found an hour later by a relief guard. The soldier told his remarkable and frightening tale to Ginny Randalls, who accepts his absolute sincerity. After his encounter, he suffered from muscular paralysis, but eventually made a full recovery. His poor dog was not so fortunate. Its fierce spirit, which makes Turkish wolfhounds such excellent guard dogs, was completely shattered by his experience at the Dakalia base. It spent the rest of his days in a state of total fear, hiding and whimpering at every noise. Next segment is called The Story of the Century. What the London Times described as potentially at least the story of the century began sometime between September 21st and October 2nd, 1989 in the Russian city of Voronezh, 300 miles south of Moscow. Here, according to the Russian news agency TASS, in a report relayed to the rest of the world throughout the office of the Associated Press in Moscow, a UFO landed in full view of many witnesses. In the words of the AP report, scientists have confirmed that an unidentified flying object landed recently in Voronezh. They have also located the landing site and found traces of aliens who made a short promenade about the park. At first, the only witnesses willing to come forward were children, who were doubtless unaware that reporting UFOs was not the done thing in the Soviet Union, but soon others began to endorse the children's claim. There were a number of sightings of disc and sphere-shaped objects prior to the landing in the western area of the park. Then, at 6:30 p.m. on September 27th, a large crowd of commuters saw a pink haze maneuvering in the sky over the park. Suddenly, a silvery sphere emerged from the mist and then descended at treetop level. As it settled into one of the trees, its shape apparently changed to that of a bulging cylinder, and a door opened in its side, revealing a humanoid entity that looked around for a few moments before retreating into the craft. The object then descended further into the tree until it was just a few feet above the ground. The hatch opened again, and several beings between 12 and 14 feet tall disembarked, accompanied by a small robot. As perhaps might be expected of people observing such a totally unusual event, there are a number of discrepancies in their accounts of what followed. For instance, according to some witnesses, the beings had 3 eyes, or perhaps a bright light in their foreheads. Some claimed that one of the beings fired some sort of pistol at one of the onlookers, who promptly vanished. After the UFO had left, the man reappeared, still in mid-stride. Other witnesses claimed that one of the beings climbed an electricity pylon, whereupon it caught fire and then was vaporized. In her examination of the encounter, Ginny Randall states that the pylon episode actually belonged to the testimony of some children who allegedly had witnessed an earlier landing on September 23rd, illustrating the ease with which descriptions of different events can become intermingled. Whatever the exact nature of the September 27th episode, it seems undeniable that the object left traces from its undercarriage, which touched the ground around the tree in which it had settled. The site was examined by several scientists, including Professor Genrikh Silanov, director of the Geophysical Laboratory in Voronezh. The investigators concluded that the imprints had been caused by an object weighing 11 tons. 17 samples were taken from the soil around the landing site and were sent for analysis to the Department of Nuclear Physics at Voronezh University. They were found to contain 2 to 3 times the normal background gamma radiation. Although on October 28th, a spokesman for the university said that this was merely due to residential fallout from the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power station in 1986, it does seem strange that the higher radiation levels were concentrated precisely in the indentations allegedly caused by the UFO's landing gear. In addition, as Randles reminds us, these levels were exactly the same as those found by the U.S. Air Force investigators when they examined the indentations left by the Rendlesham Forest UFO. The Voronezh landings were also investigated by Jacques Vallée, who took the trouble to go there and interview the Russian researchers who were intimately involved with the case. In his book, Revelations, he remarks on both their professional kindness and their genuine interest in the global aspects of ufology. He also received some startling and immensely intriguing new information. According to Dr. Vladimir Azhaza, professor of mathematics and director of the then Soviet Commission for the Study of the Paranormal Phenomenon, it was true that several people vanished during the Voronezh landings and reappeared when the UFO had departed. He also stated that this happened elsewhere. For instance, a woman in the village of Vologda vanished while in the vicinity of an occupant, which also vanished at the same time. The woman immediately reappeared in a great deal of distress, but with no memory of what had happened to her. This event was witnessed by several people, as Hazza claimed to have a number of such cases in his files. According to the Russian investigators, the aliens' movement had been tracked by means of a curious technique called biolocation, implying that Russian scientists were investigating UFOs using parapsychology. This should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the old Soviet fascination with such subjects, which they attempted to utilize in an espionage capacity throughout the Cold War. Vallée reminds us that the concept of biolocation is found in the Russian literature on psychotronics and refers to rhaesthesia, or dowsing, the detection of hidden mineral, water, or living entities by paranormal means. According to investigator Venslav Martinov, chief engineer at the Voronezh Aviation Factory, biolocation is the detection of the bioengineering field and its application to the analysis of terrain, including the geology. And Professor Silanov measured the magnetic field and the magnetic capacity of the soil at the landing site. If the Russians were and are using techniques such as biolocation to track the movements of UFOs and their occupants, this carries intriguing implications for us here in the West. It is now widely accepted, for instance, that the CIA had their own parapsychological research programs during the Cold War with similar espionage-related intentions to those of the Soviets. It would surely not be stretching the bounds of possibility too far to wonder if biolocation techniques are being used by our own security organizations, whether to find an explanation for the phenomenon or to monitor a phenomenon they already understand. As one might expect, UFO skeptics were quick to dismiss the Voronezh landings. Some commentators even voiced the notion that the traditionally active Russian imagination had finally rebelled against the repressive communist system, with the people of Voronezh confabulating the whole affair in a desperate attempt at escapism. In view of the global nature of the phenomenon, not to mention the physical traces left behind by the object, this seems a little contrived. Ironically enough, the Voronezh encounters were also dismissed by some members of the ufology community in the United States, who claimed that it would have to have been a hoax, since the reported appearance of the tall, statuesque aliens did not correspond to that of the short and spindly grays, which they considered to be the benchmark against which all alien encounter reports must be measured for authenticity. Vallée is rightly dismayed by the state of affairs in which many researchers actually select the cases that match their pre-existing expectations. This mockery of the scientific method can only lead to absurd results. In spite of the skeptical attitudes mentioned above, the Voronezh landings were merely a single part of a much wider UFO wave that extended across Russia at the time. As Vallée states, the UFO phenomenon can drive our measurement tools and our analytical powers to their limit, but of its physical reality, there cannot be any doubt. Next segment is called Have Aliens Been Captured in Brazil? In mid-1996, news began to spread of incredible events in the southern Brazilian city of Varginha. According to the numerous rumors, not only had a UFO crashed in the region, but its crew had been captured and killed by the authorities. As a result, Varginha, which is situated 180 miles northwest of Rio de Janeiro in the state of Minas Gerais, has become the most important location on the UFO map, and the events that had been described as rivaling the Roswell incident in their significance. In January 1996, there had been a large number of UFO sightings in the area, which is not unusual for Brazil, which in recent years has become the location of the most intense UFO activity in the world. On January 13th, Afrânio da Costa, Brazil, and his 9-year-old daughter Emmeline witnessed a submarine-shaped object near their home. 1 week later, the same or a similar object was seen by Eurico de Freitas and his common-law wife, Aurelina Augusta, who were woken by 1 a.m. by the barking of their dogs. The UFO was gliding across the fields about 5 meters off the ground. At 8 a.m. on the same morning, the Varginha City Fire Department received an anonymous phone call asking them to apprehend a strange animal that had been seen in a park in the Jardim Andera district. About 2 hours later, 4 firemen arrived at the park. Eventually, they came upon an astonishing sight. Crouching at the edge of some woodland was a small humanoid creature, about 3.5 feet tall, with large red eyes and brown skin. On its forehead were 3 curious, pronounced ridges. The firemen immediately set about capturing the creature, while the officer in charge contacted the local military base at Coracos, 25 kilometers away. Troops were then ordered by General Sergio Colhel Lima, the base commander, to seal off the park. By the time the military arrived, the creature had been placed in the wooden box, which was handed over to the soldiers and taken to the sergeant's school at Tres Coracos. Although this in itself would have qualified as one of the most impressive close encounters of the third kind, the story was far from over. On the same day, at about 3 p.m., another humanoid was discovered by 3 young women as they were returning home from work in the Jardim Andera district. Liliana Fatima Silva, her sister Valkyria, and Katia Andrade Xavier said they saw the creature crouching on Benevenuto Bras Viscera Street. Its appearance, which was identical to the one captured in the park, terrified them, and they ran away screaming, thinking it was the devil himself. One of the most impressive aspects of the case is the large number of witnesses to the creature's presence, which is extremely rare in close encounters of the third kind. As the girls fled the scene, a crowd gathered around the creature, which seemed disinclined to move. Some residents of the street telephoned the fire department, which promptly arrived, accompanied by more military personnel, who bundled the poor creature up in nets and then quickly took it away. It had apparently been injured by some children who had thrown stones at it. The phrase "welcome to Earth" springs to mind. According to the Brazilian ufologists who investigated the case, more than 60 witnesses came forward, including several military personnel involved in the capture of the beings. The second being was allegedly taken to the Varginha Regional Hospital. It was then transferred to the nearby Humanitas Hospital, where it survived until 6 p.m. on Monday, January 22nd, apparently finally succumbing to its injuries. The doctors who examined the creature noted a powerful stench similar to ammonia that was exuded by its skin. Witnesses to its capture reported that the same stench remained after it had been taken away by the military. The being was naked and had no sexual organs, no nipples, and no navel. One of the doctors opened the being's lipless mouth and, using a pair of forceps, pulled out its black tongue. As soon as he let go, the tongue snapped back into the mouth. After the examination was over, the being was wrapped in black plastic sheeting, placed in a wooden box, and taken away from the hospital by the military. According to Brazilian investigator Rodrigues E. Pacassini, the capture of the first creature on the morning of January 20th resulted in a human casualty. A young policeman had been injured by the creature during the struggle to apprehend it. 2 days later, he died in the hospital. The official cause listed as pneumonia. His family were suspicious but were treated unsympathetically by the authorities. Pacini also revealed that he had interviewed a Brazilian Air Force radar operator who claimed that the Brazilian armed forces had been alerted to the presence of a UFO by the United States. The UFO's coordinates were also supplied, although it was unclear whether the object was about to land or crash. Pacini is certain that this was the reason why the military were on the scene so unusually quickly. In the months following the events at Varginha, Pacini has come to fear for his life. There have been numerous threatening phone calls, and he occasionally wears a bulletproof vest. The military have been screwing the lid down very tightly on the whole affair. forbidding all personnel from having any kind of contact with Brazilian UFO investigators. In addition, hospital administrators subsequently denied that any unusual creature had been examined, telling press reporters that the body was that of a university student arrested for robbery who had committed suicide in his cell. Nor has the apparent alien activity in Varginha ended there. 3 months after the events described above, on April 21st, 1996, Ms. Teresina Gallo Klept was having dinner in a local restaurant when she decided to step onto the porch for a cigarette and came face to face with another creature, identical to those captured in January. 3 weeks later, a motorist encountered yet another being as he was rounding a bend. The being raised its arm to its face as if to protect its huge red eyes from the glare of the motorist's headlights before running away. It would seem from these later reports that the UFO that came down in Virginia had a larger crew than originally supposed, or maybe a rescue mission was mounted with a number of creatures now searching the area for their lost colleagues. And then that's it. That's everything as far as part 3 of chapter 3 of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And it pretty much ends that chapter 2. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all these cases here. Some of them actually quite familiar, stuff that I've talked about. First one involving the alien projection. Never heard of that one. I don't recall mentioning that in any of my playlists. I might have to go back and double check, but that seems fascinating. The idea that aliens can basically project holograms or their version of holograms makes kind of sense, right? I mean, if they have technology that can travel the universe in a light speed, why not have something like this, right? When it comes to just a simple projection. But the fact that it was projecting a man with fair hair, some kind of special ring, some kind of blue sphere on one hand, interesting stuff. I'll have to look into more detail on that. The next one involving the cerebral mystery, that's one of my earlier alien UFO videos. That's the one involving those brains. It got a good number of views too. I remember some of the details now when I was reading the chapter associated with that strange encounter. It makes more sense too that the fact that they were brains is not a coincidence. It's just something that the aliens were projecting as well to make it seem more familiar to us. I mean, out of the entire universe, the fact that their projection involves brains that look like a human's brain can't be too much of a coincidence, right? So it definitely seems like it was purposeful when it comes to that. Also, the other one that I did was kind of recent, the ghost that wore a spacesuit. That was the one involving that strange being that was only seen from the top up, like from the shoulders up. The fact that it had that scowling face, that orange glow, that colorless neck, its eyes like really large and just staring upwards, and then also that really, really bright red hair, and the way it moved, almost like a Terminator of sorts. I remember that doing in the video, and then that was pretty frightful. Imagine what this soldier would have experienced too if it was happening to him. And then also that sound. That I have no idea what that sound would have sounded like, but I could only imagine like it being something just being louder and louder. That's the kind of stuff that would freak me out. Story of the Century was the next one that's featured here. Another one that was also one of my earlier alien UFO videos. This was the one involving those children that had that UFO and then those almost robot-like beings come out. That was a pretty interesting story too. Got a good number of views. So it was interesting to reread that again and have some of the other encounters that this author mentioned too. So those Voronezh encounters definitely could be considered the story of the century. And if there's any more information on it later on, I may just do another follow-up video too. And the last one, of course, the aliens captured in Brazil. Kind of recent, kind of not. I think I did it like around 2 years or so ago. That one was also very fascinating. Possibly the closest encounter of the third kind possible. There you had an alien creature that was basically cowering in fear, surrounded by multiple witnesses, and then taken away by the army. Where is it at now, right? What happened to it afterward? And then the subsequent denials by everyone. That just makes it so fascinating. It's too bad this happened in 1996. Imagine if it happened today. Everyone would have a phone. Everyone would be streaming it. This would be easily the number one best piece of evidence ever in the world of aliens, UFOs. But back in 1996, who had a phone like that, right? Maybe there was like the the instant cameras, like those disposable ones, but the fact that someone didn't have any right there is also understandable. So crazy stuff. All right, everyone, let me know what your thoughts are below, and then I'll continue next chapter, chapter 4, Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. That's the scary stuff right there. All right, everyone, thanks again as always. Take care.